Hello there. In this unit, we've already looked at religious developments in Europe, mainly the Protestant Reformation and all of its aftermath. We've looked at political developments in Europe in the 17th century for the most part, but into the 18th as well. And we've also seen the beginnings and rise, and the flowering of capitalism right around the same time in Europe. And what remains is for us to look at the ideas that were changing Europe and transforming it. Remember, this whole unit is called the transformation of Europe. So this brings us to the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. The scientific revolution, roughly consistent with the 17th century, though there's no beginning and end date, and the Enlightenment roughly corresponding to the 18th century, though there's no beginning and end date. This is the province of what we call intellectual history, or the history of ideas. It might not seem apparent since it's the scientific revolution. Aren't we talking about discoveries and scientists and telescopes? And yes, and we'll learn a little about that as we go along here. But our main focus here, our main intent, is to understand how the scientific revolution and then the Enlightenment, and they're related, as we'll see, changed the way Europeans thought about the world. So this is very much about European values, beliefs, attitudes. We could sort of lump under the umbrella phrase worldview. Worldview means attitude, values, beliefs of a people in any time and place in the past. David Wooten wrote a recent really good book on the scientific revolution, the best that I've ever read. Says, in the ancient world, no one imagined, going back to like the ancient Greeks and Romans, no one imagined a day when the history of humanity could be conceived as a history of progress, meaning things getting better. Yet only a few centuries later, progress had come to seem so inevitable that it was read backwards into the whole of previous history. Something extraordinary happened in the meantime. What exactly was it that enabled 17th and 18th century science to make progress in a way that previous systems of knowledge could not? What is it that we know, that we now have, that the Romans and their Renaissance admirers did not? Of course, a lot of that is food for thought, and we'll look into it in a general sense as we go along here. The first move away from the medieval worldview, this era here is coming just at the tail end, or just after the Middle Ages in Europe, about 1,000 years of history. But the medieval way of thinking about the world, their worldview, was changed dramatically by the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment as kind of a 1-2 punch, 17th and 18th centuries. But what really started it all moving in that direction came even a bit earlier, as you can see from the lifespan of really the guy who kicked it all off, Nicholas Copernicus, the Polish astronomer, who wrote a book that he published on his deathbed last year of his life, after working on it for a long time before that, called On the Revolutions of the Celestial Spheres. This, of course, is the beginning of the heliocentric theory, which has now been mostly accepted, meaning there are some things that he was wrong about, but this was the first scientific thinker to claim that it didn't make as much sense to think of the Earth as being at the center of the universe, or the solar system. They thought it was the universe at the time, as had been thought for hundreds or thousands of years. So going back to the ancient Greeks, the belief was that when you see the planets moving, day after day, month after month, they're orbiting around the Earth. The Earth must be at the center. But Copernicus, sort of doing the math, said that the math works out better if we stipulate that the sun is at the center and the Earth and all the other planets are rotating around it. That the Earth is what is standing still. The Earth is actually moving. So he waited till he's on his deathbed to publish maybe in part because he knew this was going to be a bombshell of a theory, and indeed it was. However, at the time, only a handful of people even heard of Copernicus and ever read his book. Literacy and education was only available to a tiny fraction of the population, and even people that were literate might not be likely to read something from astronomy unless they were already well versed in the field. So this took some time before Copernicus's revolutionary idea got out there, that the solar system / universe is not Earth-centered, but sun-centered. The old theory was called the geocentric theory, Earth at the center. This is now Copernicus's heliocentric theory, sun at the center and Earth moving. And this was to shake things up a great deal. It took a couple of generations for scientists or scientific thinkers to even embrace this at all. But around the turn of the 17th century, around 1600, we see a number of leading lights in scientific thinking. The mathematician of Italian extract, Galileo, who you see pictured here, another guy named Johannes Kepler, who became kind of the first convinced Copernicans. And it was really here that Copernicus's heliocentric theory, here and now, that it first got accepted and sort of spread more widely to the point where then, in the not too distant future, it was the accepted view of the way the solar system / universe was constructed. So Galileo made all kinds of contributions to what we now call modern science. This scientific revolution in this 17th century really is, I think, rightly seen as the beginnings of modern science. So Galileo thought that the universe, this is a quote, was a grand book which is written in the language of mathematics. Everything in the universe behaves mechanically and can be understood by experiment, observations, and mathematics. So he did believe that the universe was rational, adhered to rational principles. Human beings had the capacity to think rationally, and math was sort of the supreme language that kind of connected human beings to the universe and allowed them to understand it. And there, in a sense, is some truth to this. It is theoretically possible that human beings could have been, created, come into existence without the ability to understand the universe, without the rational faculty, or the universe maybe doesn't obey consistent physical laws of nature. So we could say that we were lucky that we live in a universe where it not only adheres to rational, consistent principles and natural laws, but that we have the capacity to understand those through reason. And Galileo, in a sense, was very much emphasizing this before it was sort of widely thought about. We'll forget his thinking about God. He did believe in God, by the way. Almost all the figures of the scientific revolution, the major ones that are famous now, believed in God, and many of them were very serious Christians. So the idea that if you think that the early scientific thinkers were atheists, think again. Isaac Newton was a very serious Christian, spent probably more time studying the scriptures than he did studying physics, which is what he's most known for, and mathematics, which he was a professor of. Galileo got in trouble for propounding the Copernican theory and eventually famously got hauled before a church tribunal in Rome. The Catholic Church basically kind of putting him on trial, and they forced him to recant, basically saying, "Yeah, I don't believe in the heliocentric theory anymore. I'll take that back publicly." Underneath his breath, he's said to have uttered the words, "and yet it moves," back from my sort of title slide on the scientific revolution here. We don't know if he said that, but if he did, it makes a great story. And yet it moves means that the Earth still moves. So it's like yes, I recant. I don't believe in the heliocentric theory, and then he kind of mutters to himself, "and yet it moves," which they didn't hear, but a way to kind of keep his self-respect, since he knew that it moved. And the heliocentric theory was correct, but he would have gotten in more serious trouble had he not gone along. Even so, he was sentenced to house arrest, which meant not that he literally couldn't leave his house, but that he wasn't really supposed to travel too much, particularly if it involved his work, which was as a professor, spreading ideas about the heliocentric theory, or any of his work in mathematics and astronomy. The superstar of the scientific revolution is clearly Sir Isaac Newton. You see pictured here, an astounding genius, and one of the greatest, I think, scientific thinkers in world history. It certainly couldn't go beyond, I think, one hand, and 1, 2, 3, 4, and your fingers, without mentioning Isaac Newton as one of the greats. Einstein and a few others, but he's right there at or near the top. In the next century, the 18th century, the Enlightenment century, Alexander Pope wrote a poem, famous poet of the era. Nature and nature's laws lay hid in night. God said, let Newton be, and all was light. Just a slight overstatement of a compliment there, but it does show in what veneration the Enlightenment generation or generations in the 18th century saw Newton. They elevated him up, put him on a pedestal, and saw him as a virtual god, as it says in the poem here, for his contributions. Why? Well, I'll stick to one sort of simple explanation here, one way to look at it. For millennia, human beings had been trying to understand the world they lived in, trying to understand the meaning of life and sort of what makes things tick. And Newton came along, and it seemed to people, especially if you weren't a scholar, weren't a mathematician like he was. He was a mathematics professor at Cambridge in England, but it seemed to people like these questions that nobody had ever answered, and we've been wrestling with as human beings for millennia, that he just scribbled a couple of mathematical equations, and there you go. There's your answer to everything right there. So it seemed miraculous. Now, again, it wasn't really that simple, and it's not just a couple of equations, and it took enormous amounts of work and thought on his part and others that he'd learned from. But that's how it seemed to many people. Wow, how did this person come and do that? His magnum opus, which lays out his theory of gravity and the three laws of motion that accompany it, came in a book titled Principia Mathematica, published in 1687, just as the glorious revolution was about to get underway in his home country of England. And he completed kind of a synthesis of scientific thought and thought over even a longer period in Europe, sometimes referred to as the Newtonian synthesis, uniting the terrestrial and celestial realms, terrestrial meaning Earth, celestial meaning sort of everything above and beyond the Earth, out in space. The ancient thinkers like Aristotle in the European world had believed that the laws that govern, say, the movement of objects on Earth are not the same as what causes things like the planets to move in space. Newton put an end to that and said, no, gravity exists in both places. It's the same laws of motion, same gravity. To show you how serious a mind this guy was, he postulated three laws of motion, and in the middle of it, he realized there wasn't enough math in existence to finish the laws of motion, at least mathematically, so he stopped, invented calculus, at least one form of calculus, so he could go back and then give full mathematical expression to his three laws of motion. How does one do that? You're sort of putting together three laws of motion, and realize, there's not enough math to do this. I know what I'll do. I'll invent the math so I can go back and figure out the rest of this. That's what he did. The first 2/3 of this blockbuster revolutionary book lays down the math. The last third lays out a devastating amount of evidence to support the math. And scientific method sort of goes back and forth like that. We'll learn about it in a minute. But the math supports the evidence supports the math, and that's true here in this great book. So Newton's physics, theory of gravity, laws of motion, dominated physics for about 300 years after this. But he also made important discoveries and contributions in optics and other elements of science. Scientific method is a big part of what came out of this. It's not just what was discovered and learned about, but how it was discovered. So scientific method, the way scientists went about their craft, and that's as much, science today is defined as much by method as it is by, again, the discoveries and the theories and what we learn. Scientific method is sort of at its heart. So in a sense, science is a process of understanding the world, a way to go about understanding the world that doesn't make it perfect, doesn't make it for sure, but makes it more likely you're going to get good answers, right answers, better answers, and even allows you to go back and check for mistakes. As Samuel Gregg, a current scholar of this era and this subject, others, says the cornerstone, scientific method, is the cornerstone of modern inquiry. It entails, one, posing a question such as, why is grass green? I like this because it's straightforward. Two, developing a hypothesis to explain why grass is green. Three, making a prediction about grass becomes green based on that hypothesis. Four, testing that hypothesis through experiments on grass. And five, analyzing the experiment's results to see if they fit the hypothesis. If the evidence does fit the hypothesis, one can pose further questions like, does chlorophyll's role in making grass green help explain other plants' colors? So the power of prediction is part of this, but also hypothesis. Not sort of talked about here is inductive reasoning versus deductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning is kind of what he's talking about here in part, which is experimentation on actual things. So you're actually going out into the real world, collecting data or collecting specimens of rocks, whatever you're studying. You come back to the lab, measure, look at sort of the different objects, and then draw general conclusions about them. Deductive reasoning is more, it's the logical realm. And it is in some ways, a part of hypotheses. But this is where reason is used, and math as well is part of deductive method to some degree. At least it overlaps. And this is a part of science that I don't think we think of as much a part of scientific method as we do the inductive part, where you're experimenting and observing and drawing conclusions from your observations of whatever it is you're observing in the real world. But the logic behind it is can be extremely powerful as well. Things that you can sometimes figure out without going out and experimenting, but just by putting the logical pieces together through the power of the human mind to think logically and to reason. Now we get to the Enlightenment, dare to know. The words from one of the most famous Enlightenment thinkers of the 18th century, the German philosopher Immanuel Kant. And he wrote an essay called What is Enlightenment? And the most famous line from that essay is, dare to know, have the courage to use your own intelligence. So Enlightenment was certainly promoting critical thinking, among many other things. Philip Blom has written a couple of books about the Enlightenment, current intellectual, really good ones, by the way, especially the one I have quoted here. He said, no group of people had done so much to change society's general way of thinking, in Europe anyway. So this group here, there are some real people painted into the picture, even though it's somewhat blurry, like Voltaire. But these Enlightenment thinkers are sometimes referred to as the philosophes, philosopher without the R. And most of the Enlightenment thinkers of note were not philosophers by trade, meaning they weren't professors of philosophy at a university somewhere. Immanuel Kant was, and there are a few others that are as well. But what they all had in common, the Enlightenment thinkers or philosophes, was that they were men of letters, as it was called. A man of letters was a writer. And some of them wrote poetry and fiction. Some of them wrote science, scientific treatises. Some of them wrote, dictionaries. But in one way or another, all of them were writers. Some of them wrote philosophical tracts, etc. So these were the most outstanding, or among the most outstanding intellectuals of their day from many places in Europe. And they started to congregate and correspond with each other frequently. So they exchange a lot of ideas, which was important to, if the ideas that they had were going to change the world for the better, they needed to spread and needed to help each other out, share ideas together, and they did that. So we'll look at the Enlightenment project, as it's sometimes called, because it was a project. This is an intellectual movement of the 18th century. What is an intellectual movement? Again, this is a working definition. The Renaissance was an intellectual movement. The scientific revolution that we just talked about really was too, but these two are kind of related. An intellectual movement is something hard to define, and it's sort of hard to categorize. We're going to try nonetheless. So the working definition is that an intellectual movement is a series of new ideas in a time and place. So Europe in the 18th century. Not all new ideas. Some new ideas combine with some old ideas. But if the new ideas combine with the old, sort of generate enough heat and generate enough of a critical mass that they change the way that that society thinks as a whole, then it's an intellectual movement. And the Enlightenment certainly qualifies as that. The Enlightenment, not immediately, faster than the scientific revolution, certainly changed the way Europeans thought, changed their worldview. So the Enlightenment project was a reform project. I mean, project sort of hints at reform anyway. So it's not just philosophical ideas for the sake of argument. The project was designed to use what's coming out of this intellectual movement to improve the world, to make the world a better place to live. So this was practical thinking, at least that was the idea. Not all of the thinkers were as practical as others. So at the top of the list is progress. Samuel Gregg, who I just quoted, said progress is one of the West's great motifs. Not that it doesn't exist in other parts of the world. We'll see it in some other places. We travel around the world in this class. But certainly from the Enlightenment on, even before that, we can trace rudiments of progress back centuries before. But it is one of the great motifs and themes in European and Western history. Progress, of course, means the idea that things are going to get better. They're going to improve. So at the heart of the Enlightenment is the idea that if we have the right ideas and put them together in the right combinations, new ideas, the right ideas, we can change the world for the better. We can improve standard of living. We can improve the way human beings treat each other, etc., etc. Reason and scientific method applied to human and social issues. So this is the primary way, though not the only, that the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment are linked. The thinkers of the Enlightenment here in the 18th century looked back on what their forebears in the scientific revolution of the previous century had accomplished and were astonished at what they'd achieved. Again, Isaac Newton was a hero to all of the Enlightenment thinkers. And science certainly proceeded apace. There were lots of scientific discoveries and famous scientific thinkers of this century as well. But the Enlightenment project, though it was interested in science and did some science, was more interested in applying scientific method, not so much the discoveries in the physical and earth sciences, etc., but using the method that they used to figure out laws of motion and gravity and apply it to the human and social world, human and social issues. So they're saying, oh, this method that worked so well in figuring out gravity, wow, how exciting, because we can take the same method and turn it in a different direction and aim it at the human and social world and figure out what makes humans tick psychologically, explain their institutions like government, economies, religion, etc., and hopefully improve those institutions and improve society and improve humans as we go along. As Samuel Gregg again says, a trust in the empirical science's power to remake the world. So they thought they could use scientific method to improve the human world. So this is part of how they're going to make progress, make the world a better place to live. Useful knowledge, or what's sometimes called instrumental reason, as opposed to useless knowledge? Well, sort of. The philosophes of the Enlightenment here were less interested in philosophical argumentation and debate and cut and thrust just for the purposes of, for its own sake. Not that they never did any of that, for fun, but they were more interested in knowledge that was, again, part of the project, which was to help make the world better. So they weren't sort of about so much, asking questions. They really weren't asking questions outside of what science could, to some degree, verify. So even religion was often attacked by the Enlightenment, as we'll see, but even standard traditional philosophy was as well, because that was sort of mere speculation to them. Okay, you're speculating, but where's the scientific evidence? An Enlightenment thinker would be likely to say, even about social issues. So instrumental reason is sort of only kind of one way, or a more limited way of looking at the human capacity to reason and what it can and should do. Only questions that can be falsified. You can sort of know whether it's true or false by experimenting, by gathering evidence, data, etc. Speculative knowledge through philosophy was not totally rejected, but it was increasingly looked down upon. Reformed institutions. This is kind of inherent in all this. So these kind of bleed together, they overlap. But they thought that by applying scientific method to useful questions and issues, that you could make progress in part through improving your institutions, improving political institutions, economies, churches, schools, etc. And they believed that this was necessary to improve the societies that they lived in. So, and they were way ahead of their time today. Even now, I don't think most Americans sort of realize how much our own institutions affect our lives, for good or bad, or both. The philosophers, Enlightenment thinkers, really understood that institutions, if we want to live in a decent world, we better make sure institutions work, or work better than they have in the past. There is a downside to all this, by the way. I'm not actually making a case, a pro or con for the Enlightenment. I tend to think it's more on the pro side, but useful knowledge can be, I think, taken to an extreme, and often has, and sometimes still is, because I still think there is a place for both religion, a strong place, and a strong place for speculative philosophy as well, both of which the Enlightenment tried to kind of elbow aside. The science of man. The Enlightenment thinkers were keen on trying to understand human nature. What made human beings tick psychologically. This is really the beginnings of the study of psychology, though they didn't call it that at the time. They called it the science of man. And they did believe, not everybody believed it, but this was a pretty standard belief of Europeans, at least educated Europeans, of the 18th century, of the Enlightenment era, that there was a fixed human nature, that human nature wasn't malleable. Maybe a little bit malleable, but you could only kind of tinker with it a little bit. Human nature was pretty much fixed, and they were trying to find, what are its main attributes. And there's a lot of writing on this subject as a big part of Enlightenment thought. They were committed to individual liberty and equal rights, life, liberty, and property, in the phrasing of John Locke, one of the great Enlightenment thinkers. Equal rights is different than sort of equality in the way that we often think of it today, right? They kind of meant equal opportunity, which does go along with individual liberty, because individual liberty and equality of outcome don't always sort of go together so well. Sometimes they can outright oppose each other. So equality meant sort of the equal right to life, liberty, property, or as Thomas Jefferson changed it to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. But they were committed to individual liberty and thought that human nature naturally led to the conclusion that human individual liberty is a right. One of those rights. Anti-clericalism meant that they tended to oppose the Enlightenment thinkers. That is, they tended to oppose traditional religion. Most of them believed in God. Few of them were atheists. A few of them were hardcore Christians. But most of them were anti-clerical, and they believed in God, but they didn't necessarily believe in church going. They didn't believe in the Bible as literal truth. They tended to believe the Bible had a strong use in terms of the morality and ethical system that it produced, which was they believed in, but not necessarily anything supernatural in the Bible. Lastly, human happiness. Again, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. You see two of the Enlightenment values right there in Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. And by the way, that's not an accident. Jefferson and really the whole of the founding fathers, as we sometimes refer to them, were all Enlightenment educated individuals. They all were brought up and went to school right in this same period, so they read all the stuff coming from Europe, from Voltaire and Locke and everybody else, and so not surprisingly, it shows up in their own writings. So liberty, right? Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, two of our Enlightenment values out of 8 right there in one phrase. So are we saying that human happiness was invented in the 18th century? Certainly not, of course. That would be absurd. What we are saying is that sort of it really kind of shows up for the first time as a blip on the radar screen of consciousness here. So certainly people were happy, say in Europe in the Middle Ages or China at the same time, wherever we're talking about, but that it's only in the 18th century, and we'll see this about the same time frame, I think, in other parts of the world as well, that people became sort of really conscious of it. So you wouldn't, and it wouldn't be a goal before this time period. There's just too many things that get in the way you have to do on a daily basis. Life is just too difficult before the modern era, usually seem to begin in this century, the 18th century, to be thinking about, what do I want? I want to be happy in life. There's just too much to do just to survive and keep your family alive through the cold winter and hopefully having a successful harvest season the next year and then doing it all over again. So only when we start to see standard of living rising for more and more people, do they have enough leisure time and enough comfort to be able to even think about happiness becoming a goal. So happiness existed before, but it wasn't something you dwelt on. It wasn't something you planned on and tried to create so much. Maybe a handful of really rich and powerful people did so, but the masses of people, no. The ideas of the Enlightenment were spread through a number of kind of ad hoc social institutions, one of which was the now famous salons, mostly in and around Paris and France, but existing in other countries as well, in London a little bit also. This is where the philosophers, as one writer has said, shocked and scintillated. So these were get-togethers, oftentimes put on by nobles. There were enlightened nobility, though most of them came from kind of the middle classes outside of the nobility. There were some in the nobility. Condor, whose name was on the back of his chair. That's just so we know which guy it is. But he was a nobleman. The rest of the guys that are at least labeled there came from the middle classes. But this brought them together in what were parties. There was lots of food and wine and gossip going on, and I'm sure lots of misbehavior and angry arguments and stuff. but it also was a place that was designed to, the party was mainly for an exchange of ideas by the most gifted writers and intellectuals of the day. It was a compliment to get invited to one of the salons. Desire for status created a public sphere for ideas. Desire for status in that those that put on the parties would have higher status if they got all the big names to show up. Voltaire, as you see there, the most famous writer of the Enlightenment, was sort of the star. So if you got Voltaire to attend, you were somebody. And you could lord it over your neighbor whose salon the month before, the year before, Voltaire didn't show up to. This became sort of a status-oriented thing, but it helped sort of move in the direction of ideas being exchanged between really bright people and knowledgeable people in productive ways. Another way that Enlightenment ideas spread, sort of ad hoc, were the 18th century coffee houses. And these were most prevalent in and around London, but they had them in other countries, Paris, France, and Poland, and throughout Europe. And it's in the 18th century that we see the emergence of the idea of a public sphere and even a public at all. That sounds strange to us. I guess it should sound strange. We think of the public, well, that's just sort of the people. But before there was sort of a mass press and mass media and mass polling and sort of mass technologies, there was really no reason to think of the concept of a public. What's the public? Well, public opinion. What's public opinion? Those were new ideas that come around here. So it sort of fits the right time. This kind of comes into being at the time the coffee houses became a public space, an informal one, but you go and drink. You could also buy beer and ale and other things at some of these as well. Not as stead as a coffee house today. But these were also places where philosophers, leading thinkers met and exchanged ideas. And because they were open to the public, your average Joe could just sit down too, and I'm sure sometimes did, to participate or at least listen to what was being said, by famous writers and scientists and politicians who were sitting around discussing important ideas of the Enlightenment, important ideas of the Enlightenment project. So now we get into just a few of the Enlightenment thinkers. John Locke, already mentioned, has been a huge influence in American history, but he, for his political theory, mostly his second treatise on government, which put out, he's sort of considered to be the main thinker on what was known as, and still is, as limited government. That government is only there to kind of create opportunity, to protect your property. Right? He said life, liberty, and property. So government isn't there to provide programs to keep you going. It's there to just sort of protect your basic rights, and you have to do the rest. So there were no government programs for this or that. There weren't anywhere in Europe, but he was really kind of the father of limited government theory. But he was also a philosopher of note on other subjects, from epistemology, which is the science or the study of how human beings sort of acquire knowledge, how we know what we know. A psychologist to some degree, had a lot to say about education. One of his books, Some Thoughts Concerning Education, he posited the blank slate theory as part of his empiricism, which held that the human mind at birth doesn't really have anything in it. And what causes people to have an understanding of the world and be able to think is once they start experiencing the world and their senses, their sight, their smell, their taste, their touch starts to accumulate data, and then the mind is filled up from there. And this is not true, of course, although some people still think it is. Even some scholars want it to be true, and the Enlightenment thinkers wanted it to be true as well. It's just that the biology is clear that the human mind Yes, it takes some time for it to warm up after you're an infant and become a toddler and on. And you do start acquiring knowledge from the outside world too. But your brain already is equipped with certain abilities. They might kick in over time, one after another, but they're already there. Our brains aren't sort of genetically just empty when we are born. But you could see, I think you can see, how the Enlightenment would love to believe, and did, that the mind was a blank slate, because their Enlightenment project, in a sense, hinged upon it. If the more blank the mind is at birth, the more you can stuff that young mind with Enlightenment ideas and the Enlightenment project, and you get then eventually everybody running around with 100% Enlightenment educated, Enlightenment thinking. So this was a very powerful idea. So along with his contribution to limited government theory and natural rights, the rights of the individual, which goes hand in hand with limited government, government stays limited to protect the rights of the individual, but also the enormously popular idea in this century of the blank slate. Baron Montesquieu. This gentleman was a nobleman as well, so one of the few that were of noble birth. The Baron is a title, not his first name. The book, The Spirit of the Laws, the second one listed there, is his most famous. The Persian Letters is fascinating as well. He's also a big influence in American history, because Montesquieu wrote a lot about constitutional government, and was terrified as a Frenchman who lived under absolute monarchy. He was terrified that there'd be more of this, or there'd be nothing but this forever. He didn't want and didn't think power belonged in one person's hands because of the possibility for abuse of power, and so he believed in power being spread out. A believer, and this is how he affected American history, most specifically, his ideas on separation of powers in government and checks and balances, both of which are key concepts in our Constitution. And that's because James Madison and Alexander Hamilton and the others read their Montesquieu. Montesquieu said in The Spirit of the Laws, democratic and aristocratic states are not in their own nature free. Political liberty is to be found only in moderate governments, and even in these it is not always found. It is there only when there is no abuse of power. But constant experience shows us that every man invested with power is apt to abuse it, and to carry his authority as far as it will go. Again, this was a crucial idea in the United States in the framing of the Constitution. Montesquieu here has a somewhat pessimistic view of human nature, maybe rightfully so, and saying you can't trust any single individual with power. Nobody. Anybody that gets, even the nicest person in the world that gets too much power in their hands will abuse it. So we have to set up a system that puts power not in the hands of one person, but spreads it out, and also, in a sense, doesn't put it in the hands of people at all, puts it in the hands of the law. Right? So it's a nation of laws, not so much of men. Men have to enforce the laws, or now men and women in our day have to enforce the laws, but they don't necessarily, in and of themselves or by themselves, wield personal power. They're not supposed to. So Montesquieu, another key figure of the Enlightenment, not just because of his influence on the U.S. These ideas certainly percolated through Europe and affected the course of the development of government there also. Voltaire is the single most famous figure of the Enlightenment, hands down. He's considered the most brilliant writer of the Enlightenment, both then and now. And he wrote about basically every subject that was part of the Enlightenment project and beyond. He is most known for his contributions to tolerance and freedom of thought, freedom of expression, freedom of speech. So he believed that freedom of speech needed to be nearly absolute. And by tolerance, he meant mainly tolerance. You have to be tolerant of other people's religious views. And he wasn't a particularly religious guy himself. And he was very critical, actually, of his own French Catholic Church, very critical of it as part of the anti-clericalism of the Enlightenment. He might have been the leading figure in that. And yet, he still believed that it's just absolute tyranny to try to control what somebody believes religiously, and how they practice their religion. But it's also tolerance of other people's views. So tolerance and free thought kind of meld together as well. In a famous passage, he says or asks, "What is tolerance? We are full of weakness and errors. Let us mutually pardon our follies. This is the last law of nature. It is clear that every private individual who persecutes a man, his brother, because he is not of the same opinion, is a monster." Right? That is a full-throated defense and support of free speech. Right? Saying anyone that sort of ridicules somebody else because they think differently, don't have the same opinion, is an absolute monster. So he'd be controversial today because freedom of speech is now controversial. I'm a bit old-fashioned in that regard. I think freedom of speech is one of the most important freedoms in any decent society. Adam Smith, philosopher as economist. He was a philosophy professor in Scotland. He had as his pupils many people who would go on to be leading political figures in England. He became so well known, and the Scottish universities became of such high quality that many of the English nobility sent their sons to Scotland to be educated, not to Oxford and Cambridge. That's true. And there was in some ways, kind of separate Scottish Enlightenment. There were so many brilliant Scottish Enlightenment thinkers. We're only mentioning one here, this guy. And the main reason I put him in here, though he belongs really on any list of top-notch philosophers or Enlightenment thinkers, is because here we can see part of the Enlightenment project, the idea of reforming institutions. So Smith, his most famous book, The Wealth of Nations, is really a wide-ranging, brilliant social commentary, but it's mostly about economics, and more specifically, it's a defense of free markets and a free market system. This was at a time when England or Europe wasn't a market economy yet. It was sort of moving in that direction, but there were still a lot of ways in which it hadn't become full-throated capitalism yet. And so part of the reason he wrote the book is to encourage the leaders that he was, training, who were students of his, and other leaders that were already in government in England, Scotland, and elsewhere, to take more pains to create a legal framework for free markets and make capitalism more complete. They didn't call it capitalism in those days, but it's what it was. But my main point here is that this guy is sort of putting his mind towards how can we improve economic institutions, for the Enlightenment project, so we make progress as a society. The main reason that he believed in capitalism was not because it would make it'd be a good competition, so that a few people could get really rich, those that won the competition. He believed that would have to be allowed, but he believed that capitalism was the best economy or economic system because he believed it would make the majority of people slightly better off. So he didn't support it because it would make a few super wealthy, though it would. He knew that. It's kind of like he's saying, we're going to have to put up with a few rich jerks that get really super rich and arrogant because it's a small price to pay, because their leadership will help the rest of us sort of become at least marginally better off. So if it didn't have that kind of democratic appeal, meaning that it would make most people, not everyone, but most people better off, however slightly, he wouldn't have supported it and probably wouldn't have written a book about it. But he believed that through the invisible hand, as he called it, market principles, supply, demand, competition, division of labor, that you get sort of beneficial social outcomes. the capitalist economy that he wanted to be, brought about fully was already in place somewhat. And this is another example of what, as I said before, usually libertarian economists refer to as a spontaneous order. So the capitalism, again, kind of evolved, which we did talk about once before. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, wow, that's a loud slide. I'm not going to read that all. You probably should, however. Rousseau is the most complicated of all the Enlightenment figures. He's the most controversial. He's the hardest to interpret. Lots of different interpretations of Rousseau. So I say good Rousseau, bad Rousseau. You can look at him as sort of certainly a positive figure helping the Enlightenment project, but you can also look at him as kind of a darker critique of the Enlightenment. This is why I call him the anti-philosophe. He's part of the group. He was friends with a lot of these guys that we've been talking about here and corresponded with them, but he eventually sort of turned them all away and sort of saw them all as enemies and all out to get him. He was a little bit paranoid, strange guy, but a towering genius. But his ideas may have gotten away from him. A debate today is still ongoing. Was his political thought, and he was a full ranging thinker. Didn't just write about politics, but his book, The Social Contract, was about government. He was laying out what he thought was the best form of government, but it's unclear. Some scholars believe that he was laying out a democratic system. Some believe he was laying out a totalitarian dictatorship, which are quite different from each other. So he must have been pretty complicated if scholars that spend their lives studying this kind of stuff can't agree on what it was he was saying about government. I actually think, this is my own interpretation, I could be wrong, I think it's more likely that he was, whether he meant it or not, and he probably didn't mean it, he was laying out a blueprint for totalitarian dictatorship. Because totalitarian dictatorships look democratic in some ways, and they try to be democratic in some ways. They just sort of, like even Nazi Germany, believe it or not. Hitler said, and he actually believed this kind of stuff, and some Nazis did as well. Sounds crazy to us, but Hitler, in so many words, and other Nazis are saying, our democracy in Nazi Germany is better than the one in the United States and Great Britain. You know how we can tell? They're always arguing about everything over there. They can never agree on any subject, whether it's the economy or taxes or whatever. Here in Germany, we all agree. All of us, 100% agreement, right? Right? It's Hitler, so everyone says, right, see? We have a perfect democracy. Everybody is in agreement. Let's move on. So I think that Rousseau's thought, not intentionally, I believe it was moving more in that direction than a democratic one. But again, it's still open for debate. It should be. The Marquis de Condorcet. I put this guy in here because, like Rousseau, he had visions of human nature being susceptible to perfection and human society becoming perfect. And I believe this is a dangerous idea, and also then will give us sort of a preview of some of the ideological conflicts that come from this point forward more and more in our class. Condorcet said, a French nobleman himself, all phenomena are equally susceptible of being calculated, and all that is necessary to reduce the whole of nature to laws similar to those which Newton discovered with the aid of the calculus is to have a sufficient number of observations and a mathematics that is complex enough. He's saying, just like Newton discovered physical laws of nature and through mathematical equations, we can do the same for society. A brilliant current author writing about this group of thinkers said, French optimism came to a crescendo. This is well known in the works of Condorcet. His famous sketch of a historical picture of progress of the human mind was translated almost immediately into English. He acknowledged the wisdom of Francis Bacon, who we skipped in the Scientific Revolution, for revealing the true method of science. He explicitly linked progress in the accumulation of knowledge to social progress more widely defined, in the firm belief that ignorance and error had been the source of all misery in the past. Condorcet was a mathematician and knew little history. His ambitious overview of all of human history in 10 progressive stages reads flat and artificial. His naive notions of human perfectibility, although common of his age, are not the reason subsequent ages are grateful to Enlightenment thought. So that's a mouthful, but what Professor Moncure is saying there is that the Enlightenment, one of the downsides to it is there can be such confidence in reason that it becomes arrogant and overconfident, and there's a belief that we can perfect the world. We can bring about utopia. And it might not be apparent yet in this class. Maybe you've read things on this before and you already know. But the idea of utopia taken seriously always leads to disaster. It really does. And we'll see plenty of examples of it in this class around the world. That human beings are not perfect, society's not perfect, and believing someone who comes along that tells you that it can be is at least potentially quite dangerous. So this, in my opinion, is the downside of the Enlightenment. Condorcet was well-meaning. I'm sure he was a good guy. He was trying to improve the human predicament, improve the world. But it's easy to get carried away on that and get too confident in yourself and human beings' ability to change things. Not that we shouldn't try at all, but I think one can go too far. Thank you.